You are listening to the Information Security and OSINT Podcast, Episode 22, originally released on August 28th, 2020. My name is Josh Amishav. This week we have Chris Kubecka on the show. Our conversation today focused on using open source intelligence for finding lots of really interesting stuff. My three takeaways were, 1, how she used OSINT to access Boeing's development systems without any authentication. 2, using code search engines like Census to do wide searches to find systems running known vulnerable codes. And 3, why it pays to research out of Holland, especially if you're researching large companies who like to sue you into silence. Of course, we discussed her involvement with Saudi Aramco, as well as the email hack against the Saudi embassy in the Netherlands as well. Direct support for this podcast comes from Breachance, the data breach monitoring platform. What's the easiest way hackers break into your network? By using valid usernames and passwords. Attackers collect millions of leaked credentials from almost daily data breaches. Without visibility into which of your employees or users' credentials have been leaked, it's tough to protect against this. Integrate Breachance's powerfully easy-to-use API into your existing security solutions to prevent account takeover and stop online fraud. Chris Kubecka, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me.
So let's start with, who are you and what do you do?
Well, my name is Chris Kubecka, and I like to hack as much technology as possible. I have a saying, if it's got a web server, hack it like a web server, whether it's IT, IoT, and ICS. And if it's a control system, hack it like a control system. They all have a lot of the same commonalities. I own my own business here in the Netherlands and the United Kingdom, and I'm also a distinguished senior non-resident fellow for the Middle East Institute.
Cool. So how did you get started in InfoSec?
Well, I have to blame my mother. She was a robotics programmer for Digital Corporation for assembly line manufacturing for automobiles. And before we had the wonderful internet that we do, she had access to what was the precursor of the internet at her workplace, and that got me very interested. And she taught me different types of programming, which kept me busy while she was at work. So it's kind of like giving a kid a book to read. I had a book of code that you would type in your own game. And so that's what I did. And then it just progressed. When I was about 10, fortunately, I got caught red-handed breaking into the Department of Justice. But when I was 18, I was recruited by the U.S. Air Force to use my skill set.
Cool. Okay. And then at some point you went to work for Saudi Aramco.
Yes.
They had a can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes. I got this very strange phone call coming back from holiday, and I was in Istanbul, and I almost never answer my phone during roaming, because you're like, oh man, this is going to cost me, $5 or $8. I was in a really good mood. And I was probably a bit tipsy from the plane. I was like, I'll just answer it. And there was this guy on the other end, and he goes, hi, I'm with Saudi Aramco. We would like you to work for us. And I'm thinking, oh God, this has got to be a scam call. So I let him give me this, spiel. And he's like, and how much would you like in a salary? And I literally just picked a number out of the air. And he goes, all right, great, we'll get back to you. And I'm like, that was a strange call. Anyway, so then they got back to me shortly thereafter and said, well, we convened the board and we matched your salary requirement and we gave you 20% more. And then I realized this was the real deal and that the world's most powerful board had actually convened on my behalf to try to hire me. And then I had to give them bad news. I was starting a new job. And they go, don't say no, just say maybe. I was like, oh boy. And that's how I got involved. They needed digital security across their entire global landscape very quickly, as well as finishing up the recovery efforts and reconnecting their international business operations so they could actually be in full business again. And so they brought me on board a lot for my networking of the people that I knew so I could assemble a team very quickly. But also I knew a lot about IT, IoT, and especially the ICS space.
Cool. Okay. And notice you have behind you, you have 2 books, Hack the World with OSINT. Let's talk a bit about OSINT. when you're hacking the world and finding, and we'll get into to Boeing in a minute. What are some of the tools and techniques you use to find these open interfaces?
I use a bevy of different tools, and I try to concentrate on the free tools. One of the reasons for that is most of the time you're, I would say, everyday criminal hacker who will want to give your business a very hard, unsolicited pen test will be using, right? So I'll use tools such as Tigo, Census, Shodan, Burp, OWASP's ZAP project, Recon NG. One of my favorites is an oldie but a goodie called FOCA, which in Spanish it means seal. And that one's great for metadata analysis and also for some general pen testing as well, because you can actually exploit with it. And I love using Nmap as well, because it's not that difficult to customize your own script if you want something a bit more in depth as well, but it's an excellent recon tool. And so I concentrate a lot on those particular tools. Oh, and Spiderfoot. I quite like Spiderfoot as well.
Interesting. Okay, so tell us a bit about the research you did into Boeing.
Well, Boeing doesn't like me, but that's okay. So my first career in the Air Force, I was actually in a position called a loadmaster, which was an aircrew position. So I was the ground commander for my aircraft, and also I supervised all the loading and things of that nature. And so I happen to like aviation. And when last year I was reading about the Ethiopian Airlines crash, I noticed that some of the things that Boeing were saying about Ethiopian Airlines wasn't true. They have one of the best safety records in the world. They pride themselves on this. And it wasn't really matching up. And so I thought, I wonder what it would be like to give a little look-see around Boeing to see if I could find any sort of correlation or relationship between general bad coding practices that I could see on the internet, and if it was true that there were software issues in their flight control system. And the first thing that I came across was when I found the aviation ID system, which is where you log in and get your software as a maintenance technician. Looking at the page code, one of the developers had left a comment towards the bottom which said, "I have no idea what this does. It only prints null." So they weren't even using escape, didn't know how to escape characters. And another thing I noticed was they didn't use any encryption on the websites, including the logins, yet they sold high cost cybersecurity consulting services to the US government.
Wow.
Awesome, right? So then I found on the live aviation ID part, 6 cross-site scripting vulnerabilities. I went ahead and cloned as much as I could and tested them in my lab and was able to exploit them. And then looking through certificate properties to see how many servers had what certificates belonging to Boeing, using a tool called Census, I was able to find some of the research and development servers. And I go, these can't be online. They were online. And so when I went to the first domain series, I was using Firefox NoScript. And all the website said was, "You are not running scripts. Please click this button." Click the button. Boom, no authentication. I was in. It's like, no. So there were a lot of problems with Boeing. We could spoof the CEO's email account because he didn't have DMARC or any other security setup for the email. I was also able to get into their in-cabin IoT camera viewing system without authentication or encryption. There was a 59-page report that I wrote, and the DHS ICS cert was the go-between because Boeing unfortunately has a bad reputation of treating whistleblowers and security researchers pretty poorly. And I now know that firsthand because they sent someone around to my hotel room to try to get me to sign an NDA while I was in Vegas last year for Hacker Summer Camp. So, these things happen. Unfortunately for Boeing, I do my research out of the Netherlands, and we've got very strict laws that protect security researchers. And Boeing made the mistake where they actually have a holding company here that they run a lot of their profits through using our tax system here in the Netherlands, tax advantage called the Dutch sandwich. And by law, if you've got a big enough company, you must have a vulnerability disclosure program in the Netherlands, and they failed to do so. So they were breaking the law here. And so when most of it was said and done, the Dutch prosecutor's office said I did nothing illegal. Boeing still tried to be a bit nasty, but they did admit that they started their first vulnerability disclosure program based on my 59-page report.
Wow. Okay, so when you're digging down into, you want to find a web interface for some of these systems. Are you imagine using things like Shodan or Census? Are you just searching for various ports? Do you have like keyword searches, or how does if somebody wants to do similar research, where do they start?
Well, it depends on what you're running across. So if you know that there are some known kind of bad things to use, especially if it's running JavaScript, and there are some versions that are out there that should not be used. For instance, there are still developers that use something called Java Rand utility, which it's supposed to randomize the numbers, but it's all predictable. And so I'll look for things like that. I'll look for a few other things that have known exploitable vulnerabilities in them, and using certain tools, because they can scrape the HTML and the JavaScript in their versions are in the HTML code or source code. You can actually do wide swath searches using various tools.
Oh, you're not using a search engine to look for the JavaScript strings.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's just I use ones that can scrape some of the HTML code to make it easier. The reason being is, like Census, for example, I scrape a whole bunch. One of the reasons is Google has been trying to discourage dorking. And what they don't understand is not every search engine cares or respects robots.txt. Like Startpage is another search engine that I'll use for some of that. So Google just frustrates me, so I move on to different things. But I'm looking for key components that could signify that there is an exploitable vulnerability, fails in the process, such as a lack of encryption, or if there's a password policy that is ridiculous. It's one of the problems with Boeing. Or I'll also look for certain types of SAML, so certain versions of SAML. If they put, say, any of the credentials in there, they can be decoded easily. And so that's really always a win-win for me, not so much for the other party. That was another problem that Boeing had, is they hard-coded credentials.
So when you're looking for something like that, are you just taking the string, put it in quotes, and then in Census searching?
Oh, no, just the SAML version itself. That can also be picked up from the HTML code. So if you know that they're running an old, outdated version of SAML, where anything beyond that, if they put anything in, can be easily decoded, then you can find that. And it's a really common thing, super common.
Wow. Okay. And what are the tools you mentioned that aren't the Shodan Census search engines that you can use to do stuff like this?
Yeah, a couple of them that I like to use other than those other tools. DuckDuckGo is very good. I just have to recraft it because they also use on the back end part of the Yandex search engine. Startpage is very handy. Also, it's got this great feature where you can see via their proxy what the website looks like, just in case somebody inserted something before you did that's kind of naughty, and you don't want to blow up your test machine. So
that renders images as well. Like I know Google, because Google, when they have something similar through Translate, the images are sent directly from your browser and just the text is proxied. Here you get both.
Yep, you get both. That's
Okay.
very, very handy. And they don't block you with a bunch of CAPTCHAs or stop you from using Google services for 24 hours like Google will.
Okay. You brought up a DuckDuckGo. I'm just curious, when you, for OSINT purposes, if you would compare, let's say, Bing, DuckDuckGo, Yandex, they're all using similar backends, but do you find differences between them?
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Um, like with DuckDuckGo, you can get some pretty good results, but you can also get weird and wonderful results, which then I start going down a rabbit hole with that were completely unexpected. But you can then convert any of your, say, Google Dorks directly into DuckDuckGo, or you can also leverage some of the bangs that DuckDuckGo has. So then you can do a bit of a different search through them. And what they also do is they carry whatever you're searching encrypted and it's proxied so that the in source doesn't know who you are. So that's quite handy as well.
Okay. What are they? Can you just give an example or two of the bangs that you're like searches that you're talking about?
Sure. So there's a bang. Oh gosh, there's thousands of them. So if you explicitly want to use Google without Google uh, bubbling you. The easiest one is exclamation lowercase g and then space and then whatever you're doing. You can also do that with a couple of other search engines through DuckDuckGo. There's also, I've got a whole list of them actually,
Ah,
where you can pre-search a couple of the Google hacking database type places. Um, you can also touch on some of the what I would call more OSINT services. So you can also use them as a proxy for like, have I been pwned, which is quite handy, especially if it cuts you off for too many hits. Um, so yeah, there's so much that you can do with DuckDuckGo bangs. I'm really pleased
okay.
with it.
Interesting. Okay. I have to. I'll link that up in the show notes then. Cool. Okay. You also you were involved. I think the Saudis got you involved with a embassy hack as well. I think it was an email hack.
Oh yeah, yeah, like the
Okay.
worst email hack ever. Yeah, who thought an embassy would have a password of 12345 6, and conduct all their official back-end business with it. So yes, there was a situation where there was an insider to the embassy who had diplomatic immunity who tried to extort the city of The Hague for $50 million and signed his emails that he was working with ISIS. Ended up threatening over 400 people's lives. He wanted to blow up this national landmark in the Netherlands called the Kurhaus, where the Saudi National Day celebrations were to be held, and sent explicit threats to all of the GCC nations, their embassies, as well as Turkey, specific physical threats against certain people. It was bad. The diplomatic corps, they attempted to help, but they, unfortunately, when they attempted to help without permission, they sent a warning email to all of the official backend channel embassy email accounts, not knowing that the attacker was still on the Saudi embassy account. So the perpetrator emailed back because they used CC, not BCC. Awesome, right? And so all of a sudden, all the embassies in The Hague got this email. Thank you so much. I'm glad we have your attention. We're going to be putting the price up. And then started taunting the diplomatic corps with all the other embassies on copy. That scared the bejesus out of everybody. Because there have been, unfortunately, embassy attacks and terrorist attacks in the past around the world. So it was very high stakes. I even had my own set of a different embassy spies that kept. They had me give them English lessons, even though they spoke perfect English. So that was really strange. But it ended up finally ending well for most people, just not the attacker. So it was a very interesting case where you had already existing geopolitics, where the Saudis had just sanctioned the Dutch for some racist rhetoric that one of the right-wing politicians put on, and they had canceled over $3 billion in contracts and kicked out all the Dutch people out of Saudi. So that there was a lot of distrust with the Dutch authorities, and I was a U.S. citizen, and the ambassador liked me as a person, so I did a lot of liaising for him and advisement, as well as all of the incident response, and working with the various law enforcement and terrorism units on it.
Now, when you're investigating something like this, do email headers help at all?
Yes, and in this particular case, it was very helpful because once I was able to kick the attacker out of the Saudi system, then the attackers started scrambling with all these different anonymous services, which then it gave additional time and date stamps that I could go back to some of those anonymous services or quasi anonymous, go to countries to look inside some of their logs for what had transversed their telecommunication systems. And finally, the attacker didn't use a more anonymous system, so screwed up a couple of times. And using that information as well as other information, and when the attacker was in the office, where it was physically, when the emails were sent, I was able to pinpoint the exact neighborhood that the emails were sent from.
Based on geolocation of IP.
Of IP, and also because the attacker twice sent emails from not such an anonymous email system, I could trace it directly to the ISP, and the ISP that actually um, serviced the particular area that this person lived in, and the neighborhood of The Hague, because not all of the ISPs served all of the city at the time.
Okay, because in general, if you take, if you look at MaxMind Geo IP database, very often they are off by could be
Yeah,
hundreds of kilometers. But in this case, you're using the ISP as well to be able
yeah,
to track down to figure out the neighborhood.
yeah.
Cool. Okay. Do you have a contrarian view in AppSec that you can share with us?
Well, I do. One of the reasons why I enjoy doing my research out of the Netherlands is because it was the first and I believe only country that has established vulnerable disclosure laws. Meaning, if you're a company with more than a certain number of employees, or you handle a certain amount of money, you as a company has to have a posted vulnerability disclosure program, and that is to protect the privacy if somebody falls upon something by accident or whatever. And also, it allows a conduit for a security researcher to legally go directly to that company and say, "Hey, I found a problem with your system." And one of the biggest challenges I ran into with Boeing, for example, is because they have lots of lawyers. They seem to have more lawyers than they do security people. And they had given a specific threat that if any security researcher disclosed any vulnerabilities, they would turn their entire PR and legal arm against that researcher and ruin their reputation. Now, that's not legal here. Like, a company can't just serve you a cease and desist letter. Our laws are different. It actually has to come from a Dutch prosecutor. We consider that censorship here, which happens to be illegal. And one of the things that bugs me is why you can report a safety issue on an aviation system, and anyone can, and they have to look at the issues. But if you are disclosing a vulnerability which can cause a safety issue because you can get into the flight control software, then someone can just sue you into oblivion. And that doesn't make any sense to me. especially when there were actually 3 plane crashes associated with their software issue on that sensor. The first one was in 2009. A Turkish Airlines plane crashed just outside of where I worked, so I actually saw the crash. And that software was reused for the 787 MAX. Those 2 aircraft that fell out of the sky.
Wow. Okay. Now, just to close up here, I want to talk a bit about one of your books, the Hack the World with OSINT book. Could you tell us a bit about the book, tools and skills that people pick up based on the book?
What I try to do is I outline by type of protocol used so that you end up learning a lot more about, say, an email system or encryption and things to look for in those areas, as well as IoT protocols and an explanation of ICS protocols that aren't directly transferable with TCP. And then instead of looking at the thousands of options, zeroing down on those very important ones with an explanation as to why they would be important as a pen tester. And I think that's important because we get flooded with all this information, but we really need to be able to zero in on the things that are really going to count. And so some of the examples that I use are such as finding Cisco demo certificates, which are supposed to encrypt an email system that happened to belong to an intelligence agency. That 10,000 other systems are using the Cisco demo certificate. I go through how to responsibly disclose to the NSA because it was fairly easy to find 2 orphan servers of theirs using the wrong type of encryption, and what you really need to look at for that type of encryption to see if there's a major problem. So I try to include some good case studies. I try to use my humor. I find it funny, and some memes because I like memes. But trying to zero in on the rather important things that any cyber crime syndicate or anyone looking to make fast cash would leverage against big organization.
Cool. Okay. And do you have any questions for somebody new wants to get into OSINT?
The way I do OSINT is a bit different from, say, some of the people that are looking into Facebook and using HUMINT. I use the system information, the security settings, and what I like to do is zero in on each facet. I would say whatever your existing skill set is, just expand it because that's what you're going to love to learn. So if you like networking, start focusing more on how to use OSINT to look at network vulnerabilities and exploitable conditions whilst using this type of OSINT. Or if you like web application, then you'll be looking at different types of JavaScript or things that you can find with web coding itself. So I say do what you love, just make it a bit better.
Good advice. So if somebody wants to learn more about you, where can they find you online?
Right now, Twitter and Instagram. I'm trying to use Instagram more. They both have the same account, Sec Evangelism. And shortly, I'll be publishing a paper with the Middle East Institute on the cyber guerrilla warfare, which has been occurring between Armenia and Azerbaijan, patriotic hacker groups. Or if you know much about history, that region of the world is where there's been hotspots of world wars starting. And now we've seen that Turkey is backing Azerbaijan, Russia is backing Armenia, and suddenly the skill sets of their cyber patriotic groups have gone over the past month and a half from a level 3 to a level 10. The Armenian group broke into the Azerbaijani health department and downloaded their COVID database. So all of the patient information, and then the Azerbaijanis threatened to blow up the nuclear power plant in Armenia. So things are heating up. Hopefully not much more, but I'll be publishing a paper with the Middle East Institute on some of these events that have been occurring there.
Cool. Looking forward to it. Well, thank you very much for coming on the show. That's it for today. If you have any feedback or questions, then please contact me at podcast@breachsense.io. And if you got value from this episode, then please share it with a friend. See y'all next week.